Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now your hosts, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen.
Hey, everyone.
Hello.
How's it going?
We're back.
Really excited about today's episode. We've got two fantastic superstars talking about how to get a job in politics.
How do you get a job in politics?
I don't know. Magic. Eye of Newt and little witch's brew that we put together, and poof, you got a job.
Seems right.
No. They're going to give us some practical hands-on advice, some tips and tricks on how to break into politics or get your first job in politics.
Things like networking and having coffee meetings. And we're going to ask about resumes, interview tips. And what I like about these two is they have both done a lot of hiring, have worked on a bunch of different campaigns and in different areas of politics. And so they have some really good experience with what to do and what not to do.
Exactly.
When you are trying to get a job.
Precisely. And between the two of them, they probably have hired and not hired hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people over the 20-some years that I know Rory's been doing campaigns. So I'm excited. So a little bit about Rory Steele. He is one of the Obama 08 field people from Iowa. He's worked in 5 states for Obama's 2008 campaign. Is now currently the executive director of an organization called Every Citizen Counts, which is the GOTV arm of Priorities USA Super PAC for the Democratic Party, and making sure that every registered voter is able to vote. So it's a voter integrity and turnout, particularly amongst African American and Latino voters.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
We're also talking to Chelsea Waliser, who was also on the Obama 08 campaign as a field director. And then she returned to the campaign in 2012 to run the campaign here in Washington State. She has been on Governor Jay Inslee's transition team. She has been heads of communications and is now an independent consultant, a freelancer for basically telling you how to do all this awesome stuff.
Yeah, between the two of them, they've worked both on the official government side and on campaign side, and have extensive experience in both of those fields.
I also appreciate both of these two because they are funny and sarcastic, and you know how I feel about sarcastic people.
Yeah,
they're awesome.
There are people. They speak to us. Exactly. Well, without further ado, let's get right into the interview. Rory and Chelsea, thank you both so much for joining us today. Chelsea, let's get started with you and talk a little bit about your experience and your resume. What got you involved in politics, and why this and not law school or engineering?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm not great at math, so maybe that was part of my decision not to be a chemical engineer or something. No, I've always loved politics. I can remember the first presidential election being a big dork. I think I was 8 years old, and watching the election returns of Bill Clinton and George Bush, and taking notes on like a 3-ring binder about who got what votes in the Electoral College, which is probably the dorkiest thing you can do as a little kid. But I've just always been interested in politics from a very young age, and volunteered on campaigns when I was in college, and then went to work on a U.S. Senate race right out of college. My first boss actually was the famous or infamous Rory Steele, who's joining us today, on a U.S. Senate race. And I have worked on a variety of campaigns from city council all the way up to president of the United States over the last dozen years, and also worked in government as well for some of those candidates. And for me, it's always just been all about really wanting to see the work that I do have a tangible difference on things that I feel matter, and being able to work on things that are in line with my values every day, which is what, led me to choosing to work in politics in the beginning.
Great. Rory, how about you?
It's kind of interesting for me because I was kind of an opposite from Chelsea. I didn't grow up with a lot of interest in politics. It was sort of always on the periphery. I didn't, I didn't know. I remember a funny story from when I was like in 8th grade that somehow our teacher lined us up to meet with Slade Gordon, the former U.S. Senator from Washington State. And I had no idea who this guy was and why we were meeting with him. And, she didn't explain it very much, but I was just sort of, not engaged at all. But what happened was I joined the Marine Corps when I was 18 years old, right out of high school. And through that experience, I sort of saw a real cross section of America. My first roommates was an African American kid from Louisiana, and I was friendly with gang members from LA and farm boys from Missouri, and suburban kids from Denver. And I really just sort of saw this cross section of America that was really interesting to me. And then, the 2000 presidential campaign was sort of, I was just getting out of the Marine Corps at that time. I started to pay a little bit more attention. I was reading a lot about, politics and our history. And one of the great books that I read was actually A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, which has a really fascinating deep dive into the United States labor history. And I got really sort of excited about the idea of organizing to affect change and how the labor union really did it so effectively in the 20th century. And so I started to kind of look at ways having gotten out of the Marine Corps, I was sort of a little bit lost, stumbling around a little bit, working at Dick's Drive-In or UPS and, a lot of other odd jobs. And I just decided that I was kind of done with doing that and that I wanted to do something where my time and energy could sort of, translate into things that I cared about or wanted to care more about. And so I did an interview with the Labor Council, Washington State Labor Council, to be their legislative intern during the 2001 legislative session. And I didn't know anything about anything. I remember, referring to the legislature as Congress and having to be corrected or, really, really confused about what this Propes committee was and not really understanding that it was short for Appropriations Committee. So, it was just thrown in the deep end and had to figure it out. But I really enjoyed the work. I really enjoyed the people that I worked with. I really saw this as an opportunity to do something, useful with my time and energy that I really cared about. And then that sort of experience led to, managing a local legislative race that is still to this day one of my favorite experiences, managing this race. And it kind of opened up this whole new world to me that I didn't know existed in politics. And I just really enjoyed it. The people you met, the work that you do, the causes that you believe in, they all sort of, came into this nexus with this political work that I started doing. So I just kind of kept doing it. And I tried to soak up as much experience as quickly as possible. And, did everything from city council to county executive to statewide initiatives to U.S. Senate, where Chelsea and I finally had the opportunity to work together for the first time in 2004. And I just kind of kept going with it. I've been almost 18 years or so, I guess, in the business now. And, it's more good than bad.
I think that'll be a familiar experience for a lot of people who are listening. Like, I want to do something good with my life. I want to make a difference, and kind of diving into the deep end is kind of like the way to get into politics, I think. So both of you worked for Obama for America in 2008 in Iowa. And that is what many folks consider to be like the textbook definition of a really great field effort. So Rory, I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit of what field is and why do you think people describe the '08 campaign in that way?
Good question. I think field can be very mysterious to a lot of people, especially if you don't work inside politics. And, one of my favorite mentors, and I think Chelsea's too, Mary Grace Galson, used to always describe field as nothing more than a list building exercise. You basically, when you're working on an election, you want to figure out who your people are or who you people aren't as quickly as possible. And so I've always defined it as, a breakdown of basically three categories. You have your supporters, people who are going to love you no matter what you do, basically. You have your non-supporters, people who aren't going to love you no matter what you do, basically. And then you have your persuadables, people who are interested in maybe learning more about you or your positions, your policy, platforms, but they just haven't heard enough from you. And so I think what Field, for the most part, does is it tries to really focus on those persuadables, over kind of the longer haul of a campaign. They try and figure out what will get you to turn out for them. And then with the second category of supporters, what you're looking from them is that they just show up on election day. And so you really have to sort of, maintain and good communications or an effective strategy to ensure that your supporters also turn out. So to me, field mostly runs on 2 or 3 tracks. The persuadable track where that can take a lot of energy. And I think that's what was special about the Iowa campaign was that we were really focused and we brought all of the larger campaigns resources to bear on what had the most impact with getting people to be persuaded to vote for or caucus for President Obama. And we had a lot of different ways of doing that. If somebody had a particular interest in, national defense, we would have a famous or a very influential national defense personality, call that person and sort of follow up with them and understand what their concerns were and talk to them about what President Obama's positions or then Senator Obama's positions might be. Even in the large scope of a presidential campaign, the way that we approached field was still very basic. It wasn't easy, but it was simple. So that's my impression. Chelsea probably has a lot to say about that too.
And yeah, Chelsea, we would like to hear your perspective and also how you've seen field change since 2008.
So I think the way that I have seen field change the most, either between 2008 and now or when I got into politics in 2004 and now, is the impact of technology. And so how you kind of go about doing your daily work of reaching out to voters. When I first started working in politics as a field organizer for Patty Murray, everything had to flow through me, so I had to get in my 1998 Honda Civic and drive to Puyallup and, meet with people at the Puyallup Mall to go out and knock doors in the South Hill in order to get them their lists. And they would, come back and then I would go do all the data entry myself. Same thing, everybody would have to come to the office all of the time to make phone calls there because we were doing things off of paper lists and it was just all very centralized. And I think that in 2008, field and campaigns started to be a lot more decentralized and democratized in terms of who had access to the data and how volunteers and interns and staff could kind of interact remotely and be able to broaden the reach of the field campaign by kind of taking away the need to have a field organizer be right there with you or to have everything, revolve around kind of a bricks and mortar office. So now, when I went out canvassing in 2016, I did it on my cell phone. I don't even use paper lists when I go canvassing now. And all of the data that I'm entering into my phone syncs right up into the database. So you can even, just make phone calls from your house. So that has all changed a lot. The tools have. I think what hasn't changed is the relationships that people have with their coworkers, with their fellow volunteers, and with the candidate that inspires them to want to do that. But I think that the core of field is about team building, community building, relationships, building a community of organizers who are working together, building a community of volunteers who are working together, because that's what's actually going to motivate people to do all that really hard work. Even though it is easier now because of technology and it's more democratic in terms of who can access data, the motivation and kind of the heart and the guts of the campaign are all always going to be about what are those relationships that are bringing people together and motivating them to do that work. The relationships that we developed in Iowa, I think, were based on the human beings that were involved in the campaign. And one of, my favorite memories from that campaign was Christmas 2007. None of us were allowed to leave Iowa unless we could drive to our Christmas destination from Iowa, because if you lived in the Midwest in the winter, airplane travel in and out of Des Moines, Iowa in December is extremely tricky. And the likelihood that you get delayed in Chicago for 7 days is really great. And the caucus was on January 3rd. And so we just couldn't risk people leaving the state and getting stranded and not being able to get back. So people were kind of maybe initially bummed about this, but then, we started making plans to spend the holidays together as a team. And a lot of people came together and did Christmas dinners with their precinct captains who were our lead volunteers in their neighborhoods. I spent Christmas with my coworkers in Des Moines. Rory, I'm guessing that your team spent Christmas either together in the town that you guys were in, or were with, precinct captains and volunteers. And like for most of us, that's like one of the greatest memories that we have of the holidays, are how we kind of built this community and this family of volunteers and of coworkers as part of the 2007 field campaign.
Right.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to talk a little bit about Obama '08 in the field is because I think if you're trying to start out in politics, a lot of this can be mystical and maybe unclear about how you break into politics, how you sustain in politics, how do you keep working after a short-term gig like a campaign or a legislative session ends. And the reason I wanted to talk about that a little bit is to really highlight, and both of you did this really well, the relationship building part of this is critical, not to just winning campaigns, but landing the job. So taking a little bit of a left turn off of the field discussion, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about give folks some practical advice, some tips, some tools, some do's and don'ts about starting the process of finding work. Specifically, let's talk about informational interviews and thinking about this from the perspective of giving advice to a recent college grad or someone who's looking to do a career change. What do you think about informational interviews? Chelsea, what's your definition of an ideal informational interview?
An informational interview is all about relationship building, and building relationships is the most important thing that you can do, I think, to have a successful career in politics. I actually went out to drinks with 3 people who had worked for me in the 2008 campaign as I was preparing for this podcast, and I was asking them, what do I talk about on this podcast? What's your best advice for like being successful in a career in politics? And the first thing they said was like, don't date too many of your coworkers. Just a few.
Some of them can wind up being your wife.
Yeah, that's actually what the case was. Like, if you feel like you're going to miss out on the person you're going to marry, go ahead and date that coworker. But like, don't date too many coworkers, right? Because like 1 is okay, 4 is probably not okay. So that was their first piece of advice. But their second piece of advice,
practical
write down
advice.
the list.
That's
I know.
practical
Sorry.
advice.
The second piece of advice was just building relationships, right? And so with an informational interview, you are just trying to make a connection to somebody who you hope to create a sustained relationship with. I think that what you want to get out of that is learning about this person and like the work that they do now, the path that they took to where they got, and then hopefully potentially that they would be willing to introduce you to other people who work in their field that would be good for you to talk to. My approach is always that you want to approach these conversations with like a handshake, looking for a handshake and not a hand out, if that makes sense. So you shouldn't really be asking for much other than just trying to learn and ask questions, gather information, and then if it makes sense and it's appropriate, saying, is there anybody else that you think I should talk to who would be helpful for me to, meet what these goals are that I have for my career or my next step.
That's so true. I've had these informational interviews. I probably do about a dozen of them every year. And I have people that it's like they want me to be the plumber, right? They come sit down in front of me and say, go fix this, like get me a job, right? They don't come with questions. Right. They're not curious about they haven't thought about, how they want to plot out their career. It's literally just sitting down and like, so tell me the jobs that are available. That's not the way informational interviews work.
Yeah. I think that like these informational interviews, like Chelsea was saying, you gotta come with a specific something, like it really kind of bothers me when people just want to meet to like, let me pick your brain, right? Like I'm all for the conversation and sort of getting to know how I got to where I am and, how I can be helpful and all that stuff. But you gotta come a little prepared. You gotta have some questions. You gotta like have an idea of what you want to do, because it gets really complicated sometimes, and it's helpful when you're prepared for those interviews.
Yeah. And I think that you, as the person who's asked for the informational interview, you really need to be prepared to drive the conversation. You shouldn't plan to take up more than probably 30 minutes of their time. If they have more than that, or, they can agree to more than that, that's great. But like really, like before you go into the conversation, think about how you want to open the conversation, think about how you want to present, your background and what your goals are, and then have a list of, maybe 5 questions that you want to make sure that you ask. And then let the conversation go from there. But it's definitely on you to make sure that, it's a good conversation and that you are getting out of it what you need.
So I know that for me, I particularly recently, I've scheduled appointments to do a couple informational interviews, and I have been stood up twice.
Ugh.
And so I want to know from both of you, what not to do, or do you have any particular horror stories of informational interviews that just went really, really badly?
I think that's the worst, right? Is being stood up, because you are, you're trying to be generous with your time and your experience. And when somebody is disrespectful to that, I don't think it gets much worse than just being stood up, or, showing up really late, or not being prepared. I'm assuming that you're asking for this interview because you would like my advice, or you would like some sort of knowledge based off of my experiences. And so I've had a couple where it gets a little argumentative, and I'm always like, well, this is my experience, right? This is how I did it. Doesn't have to be how you did it, and I think you have to, if you're asking for these interviews, you have to sort of know that sometimes the way that this person did it isn't the way that you're going to or want to do it. And so when I talk to folks, I always try to be very broad and be very there's endless possibilities of how you can be involved politically. It's not just campaigns. It's, you could, have a policy expertise that you want to go down, or you could have an advocacy expertise that you care about, an issue that you're really passionate about. So, be open to what the person is saying, and just understand that it's not always, black or white type of advice.
Sounds to me, Rory, like you're hesitant to put someone on blast. Do you have a story?
Well, I just said it was a couple of years ago, and it was somebody that I had worked with, but I didn't really work all that closely with. I forget what exactly I had said, but I think I had said something like, don't have your blinders on about, how you want your career to shake out, because I think when you do that, you sort of miss opportunities. And he was like, well, that doesn't sound like a very good strategy to getting to my end goal. And I was like, well, all right, man, you don't have to take my word as gospel. I was just sort of telling you from my experience that I like to keep my, options open, and my eyes, I don't try and get too rigid in what my career path will be, because I think opportunities come up when you least expect them sometimes. You got to be open to that.
Chelsea, what about you?
I think everybody can have accidental disasters, so don't beat yourself up if they do happen. Like, I was just thinking about this time I had an informational interview with a relatively senior person at just a little global coffee company based here in Seattle, Washington. And I was driving there, and we had like a classic Seattle traffic situation where literally a semi overturned on I-5, and then it started snowing.
Oh, no. For those who don't live in the area, that's like the worst case scenario for traffic in the Puget Sound. It's
like DEFCON 5 times 100. And so I-5 stopped, and I was like, unless I can call Uber helicopter, I am not getting to this effing meeting, right? So I had to call her assistant, and I had to cancel the meeting, right? And I felt like a big jerk. But, I could see that this is going to happen 30 minutes before I was going to be late. So I called, and I gave her as much heads up as I could. And she rescheduled the meeting the next day. It was fine. I also have a friend who was lucky to get some introductions to really senior people in DC, because he had interned for somebody who was really senior in DC, and they set, him up with some of their peers. And he didn't really do the best job of researching some of these conversations before he went into them. So he went and had a couple of them, and then he researched the person afterwards, and he's like, oh crap, I just had coffee with the communications director of the DNC, and I really wasn't paying attention, So I think and I don't think that he really screwed up the meeting in any way, but I just think that you put yourself at risk if you're not really doing your homework on who you're meeting with in advance about looking them up on LinkedIn. Don't worry that they're going to see that you look them up on LinkedIn. Actually, when they see that you look them up on LinkedIn, they're going to think, oh, this person does their homework. But take the time to learn a little bit about them, what you can before you meet with them, so that you can kind of ask more engaged and substantive questions than just tell me about your career path. Since that's literally publicly available information to all of us at this point.
It's funny. There was a period maybe like 2 or 3 years ago where every informational interview I was getting the same question at the end, which was like, what's a book that you'd recommend that I'd read? And it's like, I don't have time to read books. What are books? I don't know. I'm working on campaigns. I don't have time for book reading. It was funny because that was literally my reaction like 14 times in a row. It was like, I don't have time to read books. I sometimes listen to books on an airplane or in my car, but I don't read books anymore. It was funny. Between the two of you, you've probably likely hired or managed hundreds of employees over the years between high intensity campaigns and fast paced, organizations or administrations. So we're wondering if you could take a little bit of time and give us your perspective on what you're seeking in terms of experience or skill sets from a particular prospect. Rory, what's most important to you, an attention-grabbing cover letter or an excellent and concise resume?
It's a good question. And I was thinking about this because the honest answer is I love a good cover letter. I think the cover letters give you like a much broader perspective on who this person is and why they're doing the thing that they're doing, or they're trying to do the thing they're doing. But the problem is like oftentimes in campaigns, you're just given a stack of resumes and, you got to call your way through it and, take a look at the ones that are most interesting and compelling to you. So I think it's probably equally important, to have a strong resume and a good cover letter if there's an opportunity for a cover letter. That said, though, like one of the things that does not impress me are super fancy resumes, right? I just, it's a profile of your experiences. And, I like when it's well organized, it's easy to read, that's free of, grammatical or spelling errors. Honestly, I take much more stock in if that resume does grab my attention. I take much more stock in like that initial phone call, even before the interview. I like to, is this person, relaxed and calm and easy to talk to and friendly and, all that stuff. And so I'm looking more for sort of a particular personality than I am in like a list of their job experiences over the years. So.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'd also say that for me, what I'm looking for in your resume is for you to show me in your resume how all of your skills and experience translates into the job I'm hiring for, so that I don't have to do that work as a hiring manager to like interpret or extrapolate how your experience relates to what I'm looking for, which is why you should be changing and updating your resume for every single job that you apply to and tailoring it. And I can give you a specific example of how this is played out in hiring that I've done. So I was hiring field organizers for the Obama campaign in Washington State in 2008. And I got a resume from this guy who, had volunteered on some campaigns and like had probably been in the Young Dems in college or something like that. I don't remember, but no, paid campaign experience and no internships either. But his last job, he had sold shoes at Nordstrom for 2 years. And he had been the top seller in like the women's contemporary shoe department for a year. He said that he had exceeded all of his sales goals. He built relationships with customers, that he had gotten such and such award for being like a great team member with his coworkers. And I read that and I just replaced women's shoes with Democratic voters in Bellevue. And I was like, this is my guy. I am hiring this guy. And I hired him. And it was one of the best hires I've ever made. And there were so many translatable skills between his incredible success at selling women's shoes at Nordstrom and being a good field organizer. I probably wouldn't have gotten to that point, though, if he hadn't done a good job of translating his skills into what I was looking for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to add to Chelsea's point there, I think retail experience is always something I look for, whether it's selling shoes or working as a waiter or waitress at a restaurant, anything where you have to deal with the public and you have to sort of manage their expectations or their wants and needs, I think is translates into really great experience, especially on political campaigns, because that's essentially what you're trying to do.
Well, not just political campaigns. I have changed careers a couple of times. And when I was searching for a traffic reporting job on the radio, I got hired because of my retail experience. My future boss told me in my interview that my experience with customer service means that I know what people want to hear and that was going to translate well to the radio. And I almost didn't put that job on my resume because I didn't think that it mattered. And so I want to just back up both of you and say, anyone thinking about not putting that kind of stuff on your resume, absolutely include it.
Yeah. Do you have strong preferences on 1-page resumes versus 2-page resumes?
Yeah. Yeah.
What might that preference be?
I mean, my preference is if you just have a couple jobs out of college, there's really no reasonable argument for why you can't get that shit on 1 page.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Fair point.
I agree. I do think that there comes a time, though, that you do have to transition into the 2-pager, especially in campaigns and politics, because you're moving from job to job pretty frequently. And so I think, but not when you're first getting started, not, like 1 page. Otherwise, you just kind of look like somebody takes themselves a little bit too seriously.
Do you check out a person's Facebook when they apply and or their social media? And if so, why?
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at, what kind of person this is, like I'm bringing them onto an organization who, somebody's, their personal credibility and reputation is at stake. I am looking for, what kind of person is this? And I'm also looking, I think there's a judgment issue there too. What you're willing to put on Facebook, and either it's your commentary or your pictures. I think some people are a little bit too, out there with their opinions and the pictures that they put up, and you don't want that to reflect negatively on the organization. It's your online reputation, and that's important to an organization. So.
Yep. Ding, ding. I'm going to double click on that one. I think when I do that, I am looking at your judgment, but I'm not looking to make judgments about you, if that makes sense. Right. So have you exercised good judgment in what you shared about yourself with the world? But the content of that, if you and I have dramatically different opinions on Bernie and Hillary, honestly, more power to you. I'm not going to judge you or not hire you because I don't agree with your political opinions. Or if you got in a Twitter fight with somebody about, some really important policy issue. I actually think that's good. It's more about like what Rory said about your judgment about public information.
Yeah, there's this tension and pull I find with the sort of new graduating class. Every year it's a new tension about, well, this is who I am. I shouldn't have to censor. I shouldn't have to monitor this behavior. There's that sentiment of, well, I'm just being authentic. This is who I am as a person. I appreciate that. My argument back is always, until you're making all the hiring decisions and the voting population reflects that viewpoint, then I think we have to sanitize a little bit our online profiles.
Right. And I think about, what I was saying earlier about organizing within your community. You have to realize that you're representing something bigger than yourself through these endeavors. And, when people think of Patty Murray or Barack Obama, they might think of the organizer who was with them first. That might be one of the first things they think of. And so, you really have to understand the impact that your actions on social media have to the larger community that you're working to organize within.
So now that we have explored informational interviews and what to put on your resume and cover letter as we walk down this path of getting a job in politics, can we talk about interviews for a few minutes? We want to hear some of your expertise on what makes for a good interview or a bad interview, and kind of what you're looking for in that interview process. So, Chelsea, as a hiring employer or direct report, what are you hoping to see in an interview that you're not getting from the cover letter or the resume beforehand?
I think, what I'm really just looking for is how do people go about meeting somebody that they don't know when you're thinking about hiring somebody for a campaign. You as an organizer, or really in any job on a campaign, you have to build relationships quickly with anybody that you haven't met before, whether that's going to be a volunteer or a party leader or a reporter or, even the candidate themselves. So I'm just really looking for like, how do you interact with people that you don't know? Are you comfortable in that setting? Are you able to kind of introduce yourself and give people kind of the full picture of who you are and what you're trying to accomplish? And the interview is kind of like a proxy for how would you do that in a campaign setting as an organizer or, any other job on a campaign.
So would you say that the interviews matter more or less or equal to like the resume and cover letter?
I would say more, I would say it's the most important part of the process there. You got to get your foot in the door with the resume and cover letter. But when you're coming in for an interview, that's where I'm really making my decision.
Chelsea, you agree?
Yeah, I would. And I would also say, just on a practical level for approaching interviews, you should always have a really great thesis statement for why you want the job. You should always have kind of in your own head, what are the 3 things about myself that I need to convey in this conversation, regardless of whether I'm asked? Like if you work in communications and you work with the press, you always have kind of your message that you're trying to get across, regardless of what questions are asked. And you should approach interviews exactly the same way. You should, before you go to the interview, write down, here's the 5 things I want this person to know about me. And then when you have a question that tees you up to talk about those things, take that opportunity. Finally, a lot of interviews will always close with like that annoying and classic question of, well, what else do you want us to know about you? Or are there any other things that we didn't talk about? Or what other questions do you have for me? Which is really just the interviewer's way of like honestly being lazy and putting it on you to like wrap the whole thing up. And so I would say that like, never fail to answer that question. Never say nope. Just always use that as an opportunity to restate your case. Even if they say, do you have any other questions? You don't even have to ask a question. You just need to use that as an opportunity to once again say like, well, I just really appreciate you having me here today. And I'm really interested in this job for all these other reasons. I think you've answered most of my substantive questions, but I'm really excited about this job. Always use that as an opportunity for a closing statement.
Just don't ask what books you've read in the last.
Just
don't ask that question.
Right.
I think I put maybe too much credence on the actual interview itself because, and I want people to rise to the occasion and get over the nerves, the testing anxiety that may come from the interview, because they're going to be in a million uncomfortable situations on a campaign or an elected office or dealing with an elected official. And if you can't do it with me, who's possibly going to put food on your table by hiring you, then you probably can't do it with a voter or a candidate that's in the middle of a crisis, or so I probably put too much emphasis on the interview, but I think you have provided some really practical tips on it. Do you have any advice on getting over those nerves, those jitters, so that you can nail the interview?
Yeah, so I have a trick that I don't know if I should expose to the world, but whatever, here we go. I listen to really aggressive rap music before I go into an interview.
Yes.
So, some NWA or Eminem or, something. And it gets, it's so stupid, but it just gets me in this frame of mind of like, I can do this, like I'm good enough to do this. I'm going to walk into this interview and kind of blow people away. If it's not rap music for you, just something that sort of pumps you up a little bit. Maybe it's a political speech that you really enjoyed or a different type of music that you really like. But I just try and get sort of like psyched about the opportunity and the interview before I walk in.
That's amazing.
So for me, I get really nervous, I got to tell you. And I have had to figure out ways to manage this over the years. It usually manifests itself for me, and then I will get so nervous I can't eat before an interview because I just work myself up into this froth of anxiety. So I'm always like, okay, you're gonna do this, you're gonna do a great job, you're gonna use these nerves to nail it, and then I try to convince myself I'm gonna reward myself with a big meal. So it's the incentive of getting over it and getting to eat again is what's really exciting to me. But I do also feel like nerves are not a bad thing, and you shouldn't feel bad for feeling nervous. That honestly, every time I have to speak in public, I get nervous. Every time I have to do something like this, I get nervous. And I've often found that when I don't get nervous, it's because I'm not invested enough in it. And so just find a way to use that and channel it. But it can actually be a good thing, and it can be a sign that you're moving in the right direction, that you're nervous.
That's great. Let's move to building a career in this business, or climbing the ladder, so to speak. The retention rate, particularly on the campaign side, of good political people is not great. At least that's a perception, probably. And I think there are arguments made probably on both sides of yes, it is, or no, it isn't. On one hand, we do lose good talent every year because of that gap period between the end of an election and the start of a new campaign, or that, uncertainty of decompression and then getting yourself psyched up for another round of campaigns. On the other hand, both of you are really great examples of longevity and perseverance in chew 'em up and spit 'em out kind of career. So I'm wondering, how difficult do you think it is for folks to find work after a campaign, and what tips or tricks you might have for that? Rory, do you have any examples of things that people can do after the campaign, or advice there?
Yeah, it is really difficult, especially when you're first getting going with it. I've had some, I've been pretty fortunate to not have too many gaps in between, one job to the next, or at least gaps that I wasn't financially prepared for. But, in the first couple of years, there would be 6, 8, 10, 12-week gaps from one job to the next. And I guess my best advice is just to be aggressive about it, to stay tuned in after campaign ends and you're, suddenly out of work, obviously take some time for some self-care and some sleep and all that stuff. But as soon as you can, update your resume, start talking to, your bosses from the campaign. One of the things that I think is really great about most political work that I've done is I've always had bosses who looked out for me afterwards, and really did work to try and help me find the next thing. Same thing with consultants. Seattle has a really robust consultant community, and they are quickly transitioning from their campaign, from that year into what's next. And they're usually looking for people to help them get these projects off the ground. So sometimes there's really good sort of in-between jobs of helping do research, or, doing call time with a candidate for a consulting firm, or, little jobs like that kind of keep you plugged in, but are obviously less substantial than a full-time campaign job.
Yeah, it can be really hard to find a job immediately after a campaign. The reality is very few organizations are hiring around Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they don't really even start hiring until January. And an unfortunate thing I think about campaign culture is that people get looked down upon if they're starting to look for their next job, in September or October. It's not okay in our industry to be worried about what's next after Election Day. You're supposed to just be thinking about Election Day, and, you're not supposed to have time to look for another job, and you really don't. But I think it's really unfair, to tell people that you shouldn't be thinking about it, because you should. You just probably won't really have time to do much about it. I've definitely had those periods of unemployment after campaigns. I think if you're looking to go into government after a campaign, it can be even longer. Friends of mine after the first Obama campaign who moved to DC, a lot of them didn't have jobs until February or March. When I went into the Obama administration after the 2012 campaign, I didn't start my job until Memorial Day. So it was 6 months of being in the government HR process. So I think there's a couple things you have to do. You have to save money. You have to be smart and figure out a way to save money when you are working, to build good enough relationships with people that you can pick up other projects to do while you're looking for a full-time job. And then you also have to think about what are the things that you want to do while you have free time to keep yourself from going insane during those 6 weeks to potentially 6 months kind of gaps in time. The stuff that you want to do that you never have time to do, maybe you want to study and take the LSAT, maybe you want to work on some kind of project. But those are times that are, fewer and farther between as you get older and further on in your career. And so really being able to take advantage of and do something productive with that time is awesome if you're able to do it.
So Chelsea, do you have any specific advice on how to be thoughtful in planning a career in politics? Because a lot of this sounds like it's just left up to chance sometimes, depending on what jobs are available or who you get connected with after a campaign is over. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a really smart person said to me once that early in your career, thinking about what to do next is like a game of racquetball, where you're like responding to what is incoming. You're trying not to get smacked in the face. You're trying not to like make a mistake or a misstep. And then the further along you get in your career, it's like a game of golf, where like the ball is just sitting there and like every decision is up to you, what to do next. And those are just totally different phases, and it kind of depends where you're at. And so I would say, if you're just starting out and if you're really young and you haven't done a lot in politics and you've got an opportunity that looks great, just take it, just swing at it, right? Like you're at a place and time in your life where, you get the chance to try a lot of different things and see what works and see what doesn't. And so just experiment and do different stuff. You can't really the most important job choice that you make is absolutely not the first job you take out of college or out of the military. It's the least important one. Trust me on this. It probably doesn't feel like it, but it is. And so just like look at what's in front of you and decide what's most interesting, because if somebody would ask me when I was 25, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? I don't have any idea. So, you don't have to have a North Star at all times. You can just say, what am I going to learn the most about? What's going to help make me more well-rounded? And what am I going to, find fulfilling on a regular basis, and go with that. And that'll probably help you actually develop what it is your pathway is that you want to start working towards at some point.
I love that advice. And I think it's really smart and really true. And I was thinking about my experiences in preparing for this conversation, and I was thinking, like, how the hell did I wind up in Iowa working for Barack Obama, right? and it was probably the best political experience I've ever had. But I was open to doing something different. I was open to moving to Iowa because I was able to at that time in my life. And like Chelsea was saying, take advantage of that, do something weird, like move to, Florida and do a house race down there, or, I don't know exactly what it is, but like, be really open to things not necessarily going the way that you thought they were supposed to go, or the way you planned. That's what I was trying to say earlier about the blinders. It's like, take the blinders down, do what's interesting and might be fun for you to do, and just like the universe will unfold how it's supposed to. Right?
It totally will. I have friends who went to work for Tony Knowles on his losing U.S. Senate race in Alaska after college. And I think that campaign was a mess, but they got to live in Alaska for 9 months, right? And they're never going to live in Alaska again. And it was and they were in weird Alaska. What's the really northern place?
Fairbanks? Or
Fairbanks. Weird. Yeah. Fairbanks, weird Alaska, not like happy, hippie, fishy Alaska, but weird Alaska. And what a life experience they had, and I just think that and so sometimes you take the risk and you go to weird Alaska. Sometimes you take the risk and you work for the next president, right? But either way, you learn some things, you have fun, you meet amazing people. So just take the risk.
Love that.
That's great.
Love it.
So we've painted a pretty stark picture here, right? You're going to be overworked, underpaid. We're going to look at your Facebook and judge you accordingly and put you through this rigorous interview process.
Don't ask about books.
Yeah. Right.
We'll be really fussy about your resume pages and where things are on it. So why should young people who are looking to do a career change, if we're putting people through all of this, why should they do it?
Or more importantly, why do you do it?
Well, I think a couple things. I think one, that I just take a lot of satisfaction in building something from the ground up, which is often what campaigns are. If you think about it, it is a lot like starting a small business, but the timeline is super condensed. Maybe you have a year to recruit the candidate, to hire the staff, to develop the budget, the strategy, to put your, locate your campaign headquarters, install your phone lines, right? You've got all that stuff that really has to come together, and it's complicated and it's hard and it's long hours, but there's something deeply satisfying to me on election day to look back and be like, wow, I did all of this, as a manager, as or as whatever and that's really kind of incredible. I take a lot of satisfaction from that. I think the other thing though is it's, you're working for people that you believe in and causes that you care about. And so there is, I still feel like as broken as our political system is right now, I still feel like it's the best way to affect change in our country right now. And so that is also deeply satisfying to me, and when you elect or you help to elect somebody like Barack Obama or Patty Murray or Jay Inslee or, whoever your political heroes are, like that's a great thing. We're going to be telling our grandkids about that. And that's awesome. One of the things that I always say to my field organizers is like, if you can do this job well, you can do anything well, because we're asking you to be resourceful and pleasant with other people, and to use your time wisely, and all those other things that go into making a good organizer. Well, those skills directly translate into just about everything I can think of. So even if it's just you do one or two campaigns, I still feel like the experience is incredibly valuable, to your future efforts.
I totally agree with everything that you said about the unique and special and massive impact that you can have on the world and in our country working on campaigns. I would just add that on a personal level, if you can do this, you can do anything. You are like a Swiss Army knife. You are like the MacGyver of politics. Does anybody even know what MacGyver is anymore?
Yes, of course. I'm the oldest one
Absolutely.
here. Of course I remember MacGyver.
You really do learn how to solve any problem and how to approach any situation with a good attitude, knowing that you'll be able to find a solution and that you can move mountains. And it's just a great personal and professional growth experience, in addition to all those reasons that Rory articulated, that your work will have a massive impact.
Yeah. I was actually just thinking about a story that might illustrate the point here. Was in 2004 when Chelsea and I were both working for Patty Murray. She had a commercial shoot, and they were going from one location to the next, and they have their cast of extras and everything. And it was a really intense couple of days. And I remember my boss, Mary Grace, she calls me up at like 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. I was heading to a shoot location, I think up in Everett, and she says, "There's been a change of plans. We need to find a gas station somewhere between Seattle and Everett." And I just remember saying to her, I was like, I don't know how to do that. It's like 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I don't know. Like, we have to get permission from the owner. And I had like an hour to get it done. And she goes, "Figure it out." And she hangs up on me. Right. And so I get mad and I kind of freak out for a couple seconds. And then I just remember saying to myself, all right, take a deep breath, think about it, and figure it out. And I did. And what I remembered after I'd calmed down was like, I had been in this poker game like 2 weeks prior with some friends of mine up in Edmonds, where I'm from. And one of the guys there worked at a gas station, and so I called my friend who knew him better than I did. And, he got a hold of this guy, and that guy got a hold of the owner. And, an hour and a half later, Patty Murray is shooting a commercial at this gas station in Edmonds, so it's, yeah, if you can be an organizer, if you can be a field campaign staffer, and you can do it well, you can do pretty much anything well, I think.
That's great. I did this job fair for the House Democrats a while ago with George Squirrel, who some of you may know. And he got up in front of this room full of people who were trying to work on campaigns, and they had all different ideas and perspectives of what they thought it was going to be. Some thought it was going to be West Wing, and some thought it was going to be what it is. And he gets up and he says, "If you think you're going to make a ton of money doing this, you should leave right now, because you're not going to make great money doing this. What you are going to do is probably change the world. You're a little, part of the world, keep in mind, but we do this work because we want to affect change, and this campaigns are the single best way to affect change." And that's always stuck with me.
Yeah, love George Squirrel.
Yeah, good man. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. We have to wrap up, unfortunately. I know it's at DC time, so you're 3 hours ahead there. So thanks for giving us your time today. It was really an excellent conversation with a lot of really great advice.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is fun.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.
Wow, what a great interview. Thanks again to Rory Steele, Chelsea Waliser, President Obama's 2008 field staff, rockstar advice on how to get that job in politics. We'll have the show notes available on our website, www.electionu.com. We'd love it if you pop down over to iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, however you're listening to this, and subscribe to our weekly podcast, but also leave us some ratings and reviews. We love the feedback. It helps us provide better service to our listeners, and we read them all. So please feel free to leave us a comment. Love high ratings. Give us 5 stars. We'd love it. And if you have any ideas for interesting topics that you think we should be covering, or if you yourself would like to be on the podcast, send us an email, podcast@electionu.com. On behalf of Rainey Cohen, my name is Jason Bennett, your host, and we will talk to you next week. Thanks again for listening. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.